What's up everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. In this episode we're going to be taking a look at a very unique Rocky Mountain juniper. So this tree was originally styled by Naoki Maeoka at our open house event in September of 2018. So we opened on September 1st, 2018, and Maeoka-san actually styled this about a day before the actual event. He had a couple days here to work on plant material, and he selected this one out of all of the material that we had at Eisei-en at that particular time. I featured this tree in an episode of our bonsai time-lapse here on YouTube, so I'll put a link in the description down to that so you can see the full process of how he designed the tree. So again, he styled it in September, and then the following spring we actually potted this tree up in its current container right here. So all of last year, all of 2019 during the growing season, this tree was allowed to grow unimpeded. We pruned it back once or twice, and then this last fall in our intensive classes here, one of our students, Henry Lynn from Memphis, Tennessee, dewired this tree and then prepped the dead wood and the live tissue on the plant. He cleaned it up, made it look quite nice, and also thinned out some of the foliage on the left side there. Now, what I want to talk about with you guys in this episode is what it's like to take a tree that's been styled by another professional and then move it on to the next stage in its evolution. So every tree that we work with, obviously the branches are going to grow and elongate and change, and we have to reassess the design of each tree each season. So with this particular tree, one of the more unique characteristics of it is this very long branch down here. And Naoki did a really good job of pulling that branch back up into this area and creating a very unique design where overall the tree moved to the left, but a majority of the foliage actually moved back towards the right. And it really drew your eye back to the base of the tree, which is one of the main features of the plant here. Well, over the last year, the branches have elongated quite tremendously, and of course when we took the wire off, everything flopped, so it looks very different, but the actual foliage elongated, and this branch down here has become extremely long and extremely floppy. So what I want to do is kind of reassess the foliage mass on this tree and the branch placement on this tree and decide if we want to do something radically different or if we want to keep the original design that Naoki had in mind. So let's bring the camera a little bit closer. We'll take a look at the branch structure of the tree. All right, so when this tree was collected by the guys at Backcountry Bonsai out in Wyoming, it was actually laying back on its backside here. So this whole section back here is devoid of foliage. There's nothing going on back here, and that's true of the actual foliage mass here. Everything is basically on one plane from top to bottom here. So we could lay this tree back flat and it would look essentially like it looked out in nature. Now again, what Naoki did was bring this bottom branch way up into here to help draw your eye back to the interior of the tree, and in doing so he used some of this foliage right here on the back side of this elongating branch to fill in some of this rear area here. Now up higher in the tree here too, I've allowed the back branches here to elongate just a little bit, so it's starting to fill in slightly to the rear here, but of course as we develop this tree further we're going to allow those branches to elongate even more so it has much more of a three-dimensional look to it. Now I want you guys to take a look at this branch here. So this is again the elongating branch that Naoki brought up to the interior here. You can see it's very, very long. There's a little tuft of foliage right here, which is essentially back budding on the plant, but a majority of the foliage doesn't really appear until you get way further down here, down towards the end. Now typically this really isn't an ideal situation no matter what you're working with. We want to have interior branches, or we want to be able to hide at least the fact that a branch is very long. So we do have some foliage up here of course that we can drop down, and Naoki dropped down to hide the length of this branch, but again this has gotten so ridiculously long that I'm not really convinced that we need to keep it anymore. I think we could create something somewhat similar to what Naoki did, but again move it in a slightly new direction in terms of its evolution moving forward. So I'm going to turn this tree to the side so you guys can kind of see what I've been talking about here in terms of the flatness of the foliage mass here, and that'll give you a better understanding of exactly what I'm talking about. We're going to rotate the tree all the way to the back as well so you can see what that branch looks like too. Okay, so after really thinking about what we want to do with this tree, I think the best decision here is actually going to be to eliminate that elongating bottom branch down there. Now, what I don't want to do is just cut the whole thing off. What we're going to do is turn this into a gin feature or a deadwood branch. And I really liked the idea that Naoki came up with of taking that branch and bringing it back in towards the tree. So I think what we'll do is gin this branch and actually reposition it in nearly the same position that he had it, just without foliage, just as a deadwood branch feature. This would make sense in nature as well, as most of the trees that we work with are apically dominant, so the top of the tree is going to be stronger than the lower branches of the tree. The lower branches will die off sooner than the upper branches. So to have a branch like this down so low on the tree, it would be shaded out in nature and likely die off anyway. So from a naturalistic perspective, I think that's going to make a bit more sense. So first things first here, we're going to cut all the foliage off this branch, and then I'm going to strip the bark off that branch, and we're going to turn that into a deadwood feature called a jin. All right, so as I'm removing the bark here, I want you guys to take note that I didn't cut this very far back. I actually left all of these long features on here. I just cut the foliage off at the very end. This is going to give us more options later. We can always wire some of these smaller features into place to give it a more naturalistic appearance, or we can remove some of them at a later point as well if it looks a little bit too whimsical. But I always like to leave just a little bit extra, more than what I think is going to be necessary in the long run, so at least we have some options there. Now, typically what I'll do here in terms of making the jin feature is crush the tissue back from essentially the very end of the branch and then work my way back in towards the interior. It just seems to work a little more easily that way. And we're doing this styling right now in late April, so there's a lot of moisture that's running through these branches, so it's actually very easy to strip the bark off of these branches. You can really do this technique just about any time of year though. To junipers, or at least most juniper species, they'll respond relatively well to it. So shouldn't be an issue at all in terms of the health of the tree. So after removing that foliage on the lowest branch and ginning it, I think that was the right decision. It makes the tree look a lot lighter, less heavy on that side, and more realistic in my opinion. When you've got all this sort of gnarly dead wood down here at the base, and then you have a tree that's a little bit too full or way too full, it has too much contrast in my opinion. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Majority of the time it doesn't seem to work very well. So I wanted to thin that side of the tree out significantly to sort of match the gnarliness of the dead wood down here and give it a little bit more sort of a Bunjin style effect, although I wouldn't necessarily consider this to be a Bunjin style tree or literati style tree, but it falls a little bit more into that aesthetic category, having removed that lowest branch there. Now, the next step here is going to be to thin out some of the remaining foliage on the tree. With Rocky Mountain junipers, you don't want to take off too much foliage all at once because they'll tend to revert to juvenile foliage. So with this plant, I'm looking to take off ideally less than about 30% of the foliage mass total if possible. If it does revert to juvenile, it's not the end of the world. It will eventually turn back into adult foliage. And by adult foliage, I mean scale-like foliage, so very tight, compact foliage, whereas the juvenile foliage is kind of spiky and it looks a bit unseemly and it's kind of hard to work with and deal with. So the next step here, I'm going to go through and thin out the other side of the tree there. We're going to take out the undersides of all of the branches. I'm going to remove that foliage that's dangling down so we can see the structure a little bit better. And we're going to remove the crotch growth as well. Okay, so to start the wiring process here, it's going to be best to show you from the back side of the tree how I'm going to apply this. So of course you can see the jin down here that we just created with that lowest branch. We also have this branch a little bit higher here. This is one that we're going to be taking back towards the interior and around towards the back to give us a little bit more of a three-dimensional look to the tree. So I'm actually going to connect these two branches together here with some wire. We're going to be using size 8 wire and doubling up on that wire to be able to move these into position. I tend to like to use one size down and then double up rather than using a very, very heavy wire like a size 6 or a size 4 on something like this, particularly at this time of year when the bark is very easy to tear because there's a lot of moisture and water running up through the tissue. So dropping the wire down a size will help with that. Now the directionality of the wire here is going to be somewhat important. I'm going to be taking this branch here and rotating it back towards the rear, actually rotating it essentially clockwise. So I want to make sure that I get the wire on here clockwise. And the same thing down here on the lowest branch, it's also going to be moving clockwise as well. So I'm going to have to finagle the wire through here to make sure that both ends of this wire are going in the right direction. So you notice here as I'm applying this wire that the pitch is not a 45-degree angle, it's more like a 60-degree angle. It's not really necessary to put a 45-degree angle on branches like this because they're quite flexible. But of course, if you're dealing with something that's very brittle, say a deciduous piece of material, you might want to consider applying it at a 45-degree angle. So before I set this branch right here, taking it around towards the rear to give us that three-dimensional look, I want you guys to take note of the end of the branch here, how I wired each of these tufts of foliage. Now you'll notice I didn't wire every single individual tuft or individual tertiary branch. I took the wire out to the end of each branch and looped it underneath to catch a certain amount of foliage. Now when I do that, what I don't want to do is crush the foliage together. I still want it to loop and sort of just rest on top of that wire so it's nice and light and airy. But I do want to provide enough of a loop that catches that foliage so that when we actually do position this towards the rear in the right spot, I have total control over all of the tips on the branch. All right, so now that I've got the branch on the right side here set and kind of whipped around towards the back and in towards the interior of the tree here, and also now that we've got the jin potentially set in the right spot, I want to set the actual directional primary branch on this tree. So as I mentioned earlier in this demonstration, the tree is obviously moving to the left, and when Naoki designed it, he designed it with that branch coming back in towards the interior here, but I think it's going to make a little bit more sense with the sort of overall lean of the tree to make the directional branch actually move in the direction of the tree, so to the left. So this branch right here that's protruding out of the front, that originally was pulled up and in much tighter up into the tree, but of course it has also elongated quite significantly over the last year and a half. So we're going to take this branch and actually whip it out to the side here and underneath just a little bit, and that will be our directional branch. I kind of want this tree to have a feeling as if it's kind of hanging off the side of a cliff and just draping there, drooping there over the edge of the hillside. So I think that's going to make it look a bit older, kind of like an old man that's got a little walking stick walking down the road. I think that'll look kind of cool. So let's set that first directional branch over there next. So in setting this first branch here, I wanted to, again, give it the feeling that it was kind of drooping and hanging over the edge of a cliff here, but I didn't want it to droop too much and lose visual power. So I've added some motion side to side with the two primary branches right here running side by side to one another. And they sort of mimic each other to some degree down the length of the branch, and at the very end, of course, we lift the tips up. But there's a balancing act there in having it droop to the right level and then making sure that it still has that visual power. So it's a very similar situation when you're doing, say, a semi-cascade or a full cascade style tree. You don't want that lowest branch to droop too much. It needs to be pulled up and into the right location, and that really is dictated essentially by your eye. I mean, it's just an experiential thing. It's something that you have to do over and over again and see over and over again to really understand. So I'm going to zoom the camera out so you can see what this looks like in full as the first directional branch on the tree. But as I do that, I want you to keep in mind looking at the underside of the pad here and noticing how much I've lifted the underside of that pad up. With this tree sort of falling into that kind of literati bunjin-esque style tree, I gave the foliage pad a little bit more of a lift than I would say with an informal upright or a formal upright style tree. I'd have it a bit flatter. So to me, this gives it a bit more of a sort of naturalistic, softer, more elegant appearance. So now that we've set the first lower branch here, we've actually sort of exposed somewhat of a flaw here, which is the fact that this branch is very, very long and leggy and there's no internal growth back here. So in order to break that line up and hide it a little bit, we're going to use this branch off to the side here and all of this foliage in the front here, dropping that down, bringing this in and across to help hide that. Now, one thing when you're setting a branch like this, what you don't want to do is spaghetti things around. So I'm not going to take this and do like a loop-de-loop in here. We're just going to lightly layer this across the front here to visually break up that line. And again, we're creating sort of a stair-step type appearance up the tree here, but that doesn't mean that everything has to gradually stair-step up in the same direction. It could move up this way, then out, then back in, but we want to make sure that everything is on a different horizontal plane and a different vertical plane. So I don't want a pad directly above another pad ending on the same vertical plane, and I don't want whatever we set on the left side of the tree over here to be on the same plane as what we have on the right side there. That way it breaks it up visually and makes it a little more interesting. All right, so this is the side view of the tree here, and you can see it's still pretty flat on the back side of the plant. So what we're gonna do next is take this branch right here, which is actually the furthest branch out on the left side of the tree. We're gonna guy wire this back towards the rear. So I've actually put a screw up here in the top, and we may end up putting another screw in the trunk further back down over here, depending on the mechanics of bending this, but we're gonna use a guy wire here. And the size guy wire I'm gonna use is a size 16, so relatively thick. I do want it to be as unobtrusive as possible, but I want to make sure that it's not going to break. So a size 16 should work relatively well for this. So we're going to attach this about halfway out the branch and begin to pull and twist. All right, and of course the last section here that we're going to be working on is the apex. So as everybody knows, this is the hardest part of the tree to make because we want to try to create kind of a rounded look to the top, and we want it to be nice and full without being too bald, but we also don't want it to look like a helmet or a hat that the tree is wearing. So it's a little bit difficult to do, slightly difficult to describe as well, but one thing to consider is that you want to break up the lines up into the apex. We don't want it to have one horizontal line all the way across the bottom and then a rounded top. That's what's going to give you that sort of helmet-like appearance. So we want the undersides here to be broken up slightly, and particularly as we get further up into the apex itself, we're going to be layering stuff from the back towards the front, but again, we don't want it to just be one ball of foliage. It actually needs to be slightly broken up on the interior here so that it doesn't have that sort of rounded helmet-like appearance. All right, so for example, here I've set this branch, we've come up just slightly here. I'm gonna drop it back down to this area, then we're gonna come up again out around on the side here. Again, I'm using some of this foliage here to hide some of the flaws that I've exposed or created by dropping the lower branches down. So for example, here where this is very elongated and you can see the full length of that branch, drop this branch down significantly here to help cover and hide that to some degree. Okay, so this is the final product for this iteration with this Rocky Mountain juniper. It's obviously very different from the initial styling, and some of you out there may prefer the initial styling, some people may like this styling, but this is part of the process with designing bonsai over the long run. Things change, they morph, the artist changes, the vision changes, and of course the tree changes in itself. It loses branches, branches elongate, things thicken too much, so it's just part of the natural evolution of a bonsai. Now I want to talk a little bit about how I place the branches here. So again, we went over the first directional branch down there on the bottom left. It's got that nice sort of droop to it, as if it's kind of an old man sort of hanging off the edge of the cliff there, but I made sure to lift the bottom portion of that pad up high enough so it doesn't have really that sort of floppy loss of power, so to speak, in the branch. I want it to have that visual power, so it's brought up and in to some degree. Now, if you notice further up in the tree, particularly on the left side there, I didn't just stair step the branches down and out in a triangle shape. If you look at the apex, it rounds out and then it comes back in. There's a gap there, so there's an open, empty space, and then the branches flow back out, down and in, and then out again. When you're designing a tree, it doesn't always have to be in a perfect scalene triangle. Sometimes it's better to have a little bit of negative space in certain areas, adds a bit more visual interest to the tree. You'll also notice that I removed the brace here that was holding the tree up. We had to put that in to stabilize the tree over last growing season, but now it's put out enough rootage to hold itself up. So I'm really excited about how this tree turned out. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Of course, again, some of you are gonna like it, some of you are gonna like the original design. That's totally cool. That's what this art is all about, and art in general is all about, personal preference. So I wanna thank you guys so much for checking out this episode of Bonsai-U. If you like what we do here, make sure to like and subscribe down below. And if you wanna support us monetarily going forward, you can click on the link in the description down below. It'll bounce you over to my website and you can make a donation to help Bonsai-U going forward. Hope all you guys are staying safe out there with the quarantine situation. And until the next episode, take care.